Welcome to the Behaviorist Book Club. We're just a community of busy research-focused practitioners, BCBAs trying to stay in touch with current literature. You can find more on my website, www.behavioristbookclub.com, as well as show notes for this episode as well. This series is JABA in one take. Today's episode is on volume 54, issue number 4, written by Vivian Ibanez, Carrie Peters, and Tim Vollmer. This comes out of the University of Florida and is entitled A Comparison of Representation and Modified Chin Prompt to Treat Different Topographies of Liquid Expulsion. This is another feeding article. Vivian Ibanez, I think, is becoming quickly one of the foremost authorities in feeding research, and it's really awesome to see. I actually worked with her. I had the privilege of working with her for just a little bit, and I was always really impressed by her devotion to research and really her broad knowledge of feeding disorders in general. It was really impressive to see, and I learned a lot from her. So when you think about feeding articles, I've said this before, I love the granularity that is possible, the ability to go so in depth on a specific behavior that we're now working with different types, different topographies within a topography of behavior. By that I mean inappropriate mealtime behavior, the behavior of food avoidance, turning heads, spitting out, anything that avoids eating is kind of the general topic of almost all feeding articles. How do we reduce that inappropriate mealtime behavior? But then within that inappropriate mealtime behavior topography, there's also other topographies such as expulsion or packing. And then within expulsion, this article is actually analyzing different types of expulsion. So whether that be water or liquids running down the side of the mouth, liquid being spat out, or other things like that. It's really cool to see how specific we can get. And I think that kind of parallels to other research done in other problematic behavior or skill acquisition. The more in-depth and the more controlled your analysis can become, the better you can analyze a whole range of different outcomes, and the better you can serve the clients you work with. So in general, let's just pop right into it. Expulsion is when food leaves the mouth following a bite. So typically it's defined as food larger than the size of the pea. It can be solids or liquids. And typically it's seen after a bite is taken as a way to escape bite acceptance. Inappropriate mealtime behavior is almost always maintained by escape. So the first treatment of inappropriate mealtime behavior is typically something like escape extinction, where the spoon follows the mouth and the child isn't allowed to get escape from that food. Therefore, they end up taking the bite of food. The spoon follows their mouth, they take the bite of food. Once they can no longer get escape from turning their head or slapping at the food, they then go sometimes to expel the food. And that's what we're looking at here, when they spit out or let that food run out or somehow try to escape that food. It's generally believed to be part of that same response class. So expulsion is maintained by escape, as well as inappropriate mealtime behavior is maintained by escape. And potentially even another response topography that occurs is packing, and that packing is probably maintained by escape, all within the same response class that starts with inappropriate mealtime behavior. Remember, a response class is a group of responses that all are maintained by the same functional reinforcer. However, this is further complicated by the fact that expulsion may also be due to motor difficulties. A lot of the individuals who we work with in terms of behavioral feeding sometimes are G-tube dependent, which means they don't really eat using their mouth. They actually eat, they consume their calories via a tube. Also, sometimes they only have certain thin liquids and they're not used to thicker liquids, or a whole range of different difficulties that present themselves. But really, when you have a young child who has very limited has limited amounts of opportunities to practice chewing, swallowing, drinking, things like that. A lot of times the oral motor development that you would expect in a kid who doesn't have those issues is just not there. So, for example, if a child can't hold their jaw steady while drinking, if they don't have the strength to maintain stability in their jaw, expulsion will probably occur based on runoff. It's not a motivation. It's not that they're engaging in behavior for escape. It's that they don't have the skill, the strength to maintain their jaw. And no research has really analyzed only liquid expulsion to see if this is a skill or motivation. There's definitely times when a behavioral treatment has been effective, but that could be because of the multiple different response opportunities that occur when you're doing behavioral feeding treatment. So if you're trying to build a skill, they want you to practice that skill multiple times, build up your muscles. And that's exactly what behavioral feeding gives the opportunity to do when you are continually representing the expelled food. There's also some research to point out that solid and liquid expulsions may be different enough topographies to warrant separate analyses. There hasn't really been a good analysis of the difference between liquid and solid expulsions, but the fact that topographically they're so different in that a lot of times you see a lot more spitting in solids versus runoff in liquids. Even though there is some overlap within that, it's likely that these are different topographies of behavior and warrant separate analysis. The most common treatment for expulsion, regardless of if it is solid or liquid, is called representation. So similar to how escape extinction would involve following the child's mouth with the spoon, representation involves scooping the food that was expelled back up into the spoon, assuming that there's no saliva or vomit or things like that, and then representing it to the child. So not allowing escape contingent on expulsion. And this is where we kind of get into the fact that, yes, we're minimizing escape, but we're also providing multiple skill opportunities. So in a way, representation seems to treat the behavioral function in that we are not allowing escape, and also works on the skill function in that we're providing multiple opportunities to practice. However, in the literature, there's been somewhat mixed results of representation. You see good success at times, and I've personally, anecdotally, in my own feeding cases, have seen good success with representation, but you also see less than clinically acceptable success at times, and you perhaps need an additional procedure, and that additional procedure is typically the addition of a chin prompt. So a chin prompt is just defined as somehow supporting the chin for 5 seconds, helping that stability of the jaw, and this is typically done for about 5 seconds after the bite. So now we're talking about a chin prompt that seems to be serving the skill acquisition side. So we're assuming that the child doesn't have stability, so they don't have the ability to continually keep their jaw steady throughout the bites and the liquids. So now we're going to help them by stabilizing their chin until they can gain the strength to do it on their own. We're kind of spotting them. If you were thinking about typical workout language, we're spotting them to help them engage in that behavior. The chin prompt has also been further modified, and there's different ways to do it with your forefinger and your thumb and different times to do it. If it's something you're not experienced in, I think it's something that definitely warrants a face-to-face or online meeting with someone who is an expert, like these authors perhaps, before you would go and actually follow through with doing these procedures. Definitely, feeding is something where you should get a lot of consultation beforehand. So Shalva et al. In 2018 was the first study to really start to identify different types of expulsion. They looked at runoff versus other types of expulsions. And we began to see that it's possible the different types of expulsions affect affects the effectiveness of representation. So let's just conjecture for a little bit. If the child is forcefully spitting out the liquid, so the liquid goes in and they spit out by blowing air through their lips and water flows out too, it's likely that if they can engage in that behavior, they have the jaw stability to swallow the drink without assistance. And in that case, what we may be dealing with is a purely escape maintain problem behavior. However, if the liquid is running down the sides of their chin, it may be that they don't have the jaw stability, so a chin prompt may be needed. This is where I'm talking about that granularity that's possible in behavioral feeding articles. We're now looking at the topography not only helping us to identify the function by doing a functional analysis, but also the topography helping us to identify a specific type of treatment. Because the child presents in this manner with this quote unquote symptom, we can specify exactly what we're going to do next based on past research. It's hard for me to imagine this type of analysis being present in other types of behavioral literature. I think that in skill acquisition, there's probably a parallel to be had here, where specific skill deficits present with specific skill treatments. For example, similar to prerequisite skills, like if you have the prerequisite skills to echoic, to echo, you're probably going to have an easier time learning focal verbal manding versus if you only have the prerequisite skills to match to sample, a PEX or picture icon board may be a more effective manding style. But this is like the in-depth granularity that's possible in feeding articles because they focus really on that one response class, inappropriate mealtime behavior that leads to expulsion that could lead to other things. So the purpose of this article was to extend previous research by examining multiple different types of expulsion and examining the chin prompt as well, and examining what would happen if we had expulsion plus the chin prompt and without, and all different types of arrangements. In terms of the methods, they used a consecutive controlled case series. I know this seemed to be done at a local clinic under the first author's supervision. So they just accepted the first 3 patients, it seems like, that presented with feeding difficulties. They went through feeding treatment, and if liquid expulsion came up as a behavioral a relevant target for their treatment, then that's what they did next. And once they went through this research paper, they then continued on with their rest of their feeding treatment and the rest of their ABA treatment as normal. So there were 3 kids who presented with expulsions of liquid. They did clear a swallow study, and the first author consulted consistently with a speech and language pathologist and an occupational therapist, as well as a primary care doctor, to ensure that there is adequate medical clearing before starting the study. That's a really important part of behavioral feeding. It's really difficult to know exactly what skill deficits are present just by observing. It's not really in a behavior analyst's competency to look at a child and say, yep, they can swallow, or yep, they can, chew something the size of a chicken nugget. And because you're putting food in a child's mouth, there's potentially a lot of risk for choking and aspiration. So they're going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of the article, but it's really important to have a safety plan and to have all of the children you work with when you're doing behavioral feeding cleared by a doctor. They also, interestingly enough, added a lot of verbal behavior demographics. So for example, for one of the clients, Zara, it says that she emitted multiple word vocal man. She learned new mans within a single trial and demonstrated strong tact and echoic repertoires. She also engaged in vocal stereotypy in the form of scripting and delayed echolalia. I'm not exactly sure why they included this. I guess it would help us to identify boundaries of treatments, but I've never had an experience where the verbal behavior present influences the feeding treatment, except on extreme scales. So I've seen with very high amounts of functional verbal behavior that sometimes that influences, and maybe you use more rule-oriented contingencies versus behavioral-oriented contingencies. But I'm not positive. I think that was really interesting. I'd love to learn more about why the action editor felt like that was a really important piece to keep in there. I always like the additional demographic information because I think it helps provide those boundaries of treatments and helps us learn more about the kids we work with, but not sure why it was included here. They defined expulsion as liquid larger than the size of the pea running outside the mouth. And then there was 4 types of expulsion they looked at. They looked at run-out expulsion, which is when something passively spills out of the mouth. There was forceful expulsion. When there's a forceful flow, this typically looked like spitting. There was object expulsion, which was using the sleeve or the body part to wipe the mouth or to expel the liquid. And finally, there was tongue thrust expulsion. That was expulsion with the tongue out of the mouth. Those 4 different types of expulsions were tracked, as well as acceptance and all the other relevant data that comes along with the behavioral feeding treatment. They had a pretty idiosyncratic multiple baseline graph when they came to the results per kid. So they did a multiple baseline plus reversal plus multi-element. So what that looked like is the 3 children stacked one on top of the other. It was concurrent. They did 6 baseline sessions for Lydia, the top graph, and then they did a multi-element comparison between the effects of representation and a modified chin prompt. And then they finished with a caregiver selected treatment. They didn't do a reversal for Lydia, but they did do a reversal for Chloe and then not for Zara. So I think with Chloe, they needed to add a little bit more believability to their data because the multi-element design ended up undifferentiated. So interestingly enough, all three children needed different behavioral feeding treatments. So Lydia ended up with either one being effective. So either representation or the modified chin prompt was effective for her. The caregiver then selected representation versus the modified chin prompt. So the caregiver preferred representation. Chloe needed modified chin prompt plus representation, so needed both treatments. And finally, Zara needed representation. And what was interesting is that Lydia and Chloe both exhibited runouts and needed different treatments, whereas Zara needed representation and exhibited forceful expulsion. One thing that I think is incredibly important to point out is that the caregiver ended up selecting the final treatment. I think in behavioral feeding, it's probably emphasized more relative to other literature topics because feeding is such a family-oriented activity in a home setting. Caregiver treatment selection is really important and really valued. That I think I would say is not echoed in other types of behavioral feeding, behavioral treatments, and I think it should be. I think the fact that there is such an emphasis on the caregiver making the final decisions is really important in all types of literature, and I think that we can lean on the feeding literature to give us an example of how to conduct that preference assessment at the end. I also think all of the concurrent chains arrangements that we've been going over lately, I think that also provides a really clear pathway to letting the stakeholders, so the clients and the caregivers, select final treatment packages versus our personal opinions as the BCBAs. So because the results were so different for each participant, it's hard to form really solid conclusions. There was only 3 participants. It kind of read as a pilot study to me, but I think that there's some evidence to suggest that the modified chin prompt may be unsuccessful with forceful expulsion. We can begin to assume that this may be because forceful expulsion is a more behaviorally motivated behavior versus a lack of skill. And a modified chin prompt doesn't really address the behavioral function like representation does. We've also seen that representation will likely reduce expulsion, but will also likely need help as well. And I think this is really where it gets into why you can't just go and copy a behavioral feeding article and do it with a child. It's not a simple treatment path. Kids present extremely differently when they go from, non-removal of the spoon to representation to packing, and then you have to distribute the packing. And while you distribute packing, then they flop back into expulsion, and then you're representing expulsion with a DRA of iPad. It just gets very messy, and it's really harmful for the child if you stop a behavioral feeding treatment halfway through. You really want to follow through with the entire treatment, because if you stop halfway through, then what you've communicated to that child is, I'm going to extinguish the function, disrupt the reinforcer relation until you pack or until you expel, and then you're going to be fine. You can get out of the food however you want. And then the next person that tries to work with that kid on behavioral feeding now has a more resistant to extinction behavior to work on. So it's really important. I think they highlight this with the safety plan, that you don't implement behavioral feeding techniques without having full competence. And I think behavioral feeding, in my opinion, is one of the things that you can't just read and learn about. You have to work with somebody and learn the skills and techniques to actually implement the feeding treatments. Implementing non-removal of the spoon, representation, all of these different things, even using the Nook brush, all requires a certain amount of skill and dexterity that doesn't come from just reading an article. Off the soapbox, I think this paper represents the second small step in a new research line. I think getting into the topographies of behavior to inform treatment is really interesting, but I think it's unwise to draw any solid conclusions other than appreciation of the analytical methods that were demonstrated in this article. I think that there's a lot more research that will be coming out about expulsion, packing, the different topographies within inappropriate mealtime behavior. And I think that if you're in the midst of doing behavioral feeding treatments, you're competent, you do it for a living, I think this may be a really interesting step for you to start analyzing. What does the expulsion look like? And does that end up influencing the eventual treatment? Finally, for my takeaways, I think that many steps need to be taken before undergoing feeding treatments. I think clear guidance from somebody who's competent, as well as safety regulations, are also really important. So dealing with OTs and SLPs to do swallow studies and ensure safety. I just caution again, don't go into this. Don't replicate this article if you're not competent in feeding. My second takeaway is to continue to examine those topographies and look for the patterns. I think it's possible that the next really big steps in research are going to come not from an attention function identified in an FA, but rather something like an open hand slap versus a fist slap, informing the next self-injurious behavior treatment. So it's really interesting. Look at that granularity, get intimate with the topographies so you can understand exactly how that could influence treatment. And that's really my consideration too, is to look at the kids you work with, look at the adults, and start looking at the topographies, not just to write the operational definition, but see how it may influence the eventual treatment. And after that, just get analytical and use strong, systematic, step-by-step methods to see if you can predict, control, and systematically reproduce those effects over and over again with the kids. and the topographies of behavior that you work with. That's all I have, guys. Thank you so much for another episode. You guys can always find me www.behaviorsplitclub.com, and that is all for now.